The bus rumbled along the crowded city streets on a sweltering summer afternoon. 16-year-old Tanya wiped beads of sweat from her forehead as she climbed aboard, school backpack weighing heavily on her shoulders after a long day of final exams. She scanned the packed vehicle, relieved to spot an empty seat about halfway down the aisle. Tanya made her way toward the vacant spot, gripping the handrails as the bus lurched forward. Just as she was about to sit down, a middle-aged woman with blonde hair quickly slid her designer handbag onto the empty space and gave Tanya a cold stare. "This seat is taken," the woman said curtly, though no one else was standing nearby. Tanya blinked in confusion. "Excuse me, but I don't see anyone standing who might be waiting for this seat." The woman's mouth tightened into a thin line. "I said it's taken. Find somewhere else to sit." A hush fell over the nearby passengers as people began to notice the interaction. Tanya stood frozen, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. She'd experienced subtle prejudice before, but rarely something this blatant in public. An elderly gentleman sitting across the aisle cleared his throat. "Young lady, you can have my seat," he offered, beginning to rise with some difficulty. "No, please stay seated, sir," Tanya replied quickly, not wanting the older man to stand. The bus driver, watching the scene unfold in his rearview mirror, called out, "Everything okay back there?" Before Tanya could respond, a young woman with curly brown hair stood up from her seat a few rows ahead. "No, everything is not okay," she announced loudly. Her name was Zoe, a nursing student on her way to her hospital shift. "This woman won't let this girl sit down because of the color of her skin." The blonde woman gasped. "How dare you? That's not true at all. Then why is your bag on the seat when you can see this girl needs to sit down?" Zoe challenged, her voice steady but firm. Other passengers began to murmur, and several phone cameras turned in their direction. The blonde woman shifted uncomfortably under the growing scrutiny. "My friend is getting on at the next stop," she claimed, but her voice wavered slightly. A young man wearing headphones removed them and leaned forward. "The next stop is 20 minutes away, and there are plenty of other people who need seats now." The bus driver pulled over to the side of the road and turned in his seat. He was a veteran driver named Ray who had been operating city buses for nearly 30 years. "Ma'am," he addressed the blonde woman firmly, "either move your bag so the young lady can sit down, or you'll need to exit the bus. City policy clearly states that all passengers are entitled to available seating." The woman's face flushed red. She clutched her handbag tighter. "This is ridiculous. I'm being attacked for no reason." An older woman sitting nearby spoke up, her voice gentle but resolute. "No one is attacking you, dear. But what you're doing isn't right, and deep down, I think you know that." Tanya stood quietly throughout the exchange, wishing she could simply disappear. She hadn't wanted to cause a scene, she just needed a place to sit after her exhausting day. "I'm going to count to 3, Ray announced. 1. The blonde woman glared at him. "You can't do this. I pay taxes." 2. Several passengers had their phones out now, recording the incident. The woman looked around, suddenly realizing she was being documented from multiple angles. Just as Ray opened his mouth to say, 3, the woman snatched her bag off the seat. "Fine. Take it," she snapped. Tanya hesitated, no longer sure if she wanted to sit there. Zoe noticed her discomfort and called out, "Hey, would you like to come sit by me instead? My seatmate just got off." Grateful for the offer, Tanya nodded and made her way to Zoe's row, settling into the newly vacant spot beside her. "I'm sorry that happened," Zoe said quietly as the bus began moving again. "Are you okay?" "Yeah," Tanya replied, still a bit shaken. "Thanks for speaking up." As the bus continued its route, something unexpected began to happen. A middle-aged man stood up and addressed the bus. "Folks, I'm sorry, but I can't stay quiet. What just happened isn't right, and it's not who we should be as a community. He turned toward the blonde woman. Ma'am, I don't know you, and I don't know what's in your heart. But what you did hurt that young lady, and it hurt all of us who witnessed it. We can do better than this. The bus fell silent as his words hung in the air. The blonde woman stared down at her lap, her shoulders hunched. An older black woman who had been quietly observing spoke next. I've lived in this city for 73 years, and I've seen a lot of change. Some good, some not so good. But one thing I've learned is that most people are decent at heart if given the chance. She looked directly at the blonde woman. We all have bad days. We all make mistakes. The question is, what do we do next? Something in the older woman's gentle tone seemed to reach the blonde woman. Her defensive posture slowly began to soften, and to everyone's surprise, tears welled in her eyes. She began, her voice cracking. I don't know why I did that. I've been having a terrible week. My husband left me, my boss is threatening to fire me, and I just... She trailed off, shaking her head. But that's no excuse for how I treated you, she added, looking up at Tanya. I'm truly sorry. The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable. The bus remained quiet as passengers processed this unexpected turn of events. Tanya met the woman's gaze across the aisle. Thank you for apologizing, she said simply. The tension on the bus began to dissipate. The driver, Ray, caught Tanya's eye in the mirror and gave her a small nod of approval. As the journey continued, something remarkable began to happen. Passengers who had been strangers moments before started talking to one another. An elderly man offered to help a young mother with her stroller. A teenager gave up his seat for a pregnant woman who boarded. Small acts of kindness rippled through the bus, inspired by the confrontation they had all witnessed and its unexpected resolution. When her stop approached, Tanya stood to exit. To her surprise, the blonde woman stood as well. This is my stop too, the woman explained awkwardly. As they stepped off the bus together, she turned to Tanya. I meant what I said. I'm truly sorry. Tanya nodded. I believe you. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, the woman continued. What I did was wrong. But I want you to know that you've taught me something important today. What's that? Tanya asked. That it's never too late to be better, the woman replied. I hope someday I can make this right. As the bus pulled away, Tanya stood thoughtfully on the sidewalk. The encounter had been painful, but something positive had emerged from it, not just for her, but for everyone who had been present. Later that evening, a video of the incident appeared online. It quickly gathered thousands of views, not because it showed yet another act of discrimination, but because it captured something much rarer, a moment of genuine human connection and transformation. The following day, Tanya was surprised to find the video had gone viral. Local news stations were calling it a powerful moment of community standing up against prejudice. But what touched her most were the comments from people who wrote that the video had inspired them to reflect on their own biases and to commit to being more compassionate in their daily interactions. 1 week later, Tanya was waiting at the same bus stop when a familiar figure approached. It was the blonde woman, looking nervous but determined. I wasn't sure if you'd be here, she said. But I hoped you might be. She extended her hand. My name is Diane. And I'd like to buy you a coffee, if you're willing. I have something I'd like to discuss with you. Tanya hesitated, then accepted the handshake. I'm Tanya. And yes, I think I'd like that. Over coffee at a nearby cafe, Diane explained that the viral video had been a wake-up call. She had spent the past week reflecting deeply on her behavior and the unconscious biases she had never confronted before. I've started volunteering at a community center, she told Tanya. And I'm wondering if you might be interested in helping me organize a workshop series on building bridges across differences in our neighborhood. Tanya was stunned by the request but intrigued by the possibility. "I'd need to know more about what you have in mind," she said cautiously. As they continued talking, the unlikely pair began to sketch out ideas for bringing people together from different backgrounds to share stories and build understanding. What had begun as an ugly moment on a crowded bus was transforming into something neither of them could have imagined. Sometimes, the most profound changes begin in the most ordinary places, like a city bus on a hot summer afternoon, where a simple act of courage can ripple outward in ways no one could have predicted. 3 weeks after their coffee shop meeting, Tanya stood nervously at the front of the community center's main hall. The room was filled with about 30 people from different backgrounds, all gathered for the first Building Bridges workshop that she and Diane had organized. "Thank you all for coming tonight," Tanya began, her voice slightly shaky. At 16, public speaking wasn't something she had much experience with. But the importance of this moment gave her courage. A few weeks ago, something happened that could have just been another sad story about division. Instead, it became the beginning of something new. She glanced at Diane, who smiled encouragingly from the side of the room. Neither of them had expected their first workshop to draw such a diverse crowd. There were teenagers like Tanya, seniors who reminded her of the supportive elderly woman from the bus, and people of all ages and backgrounds in between. Zoe, the nursing student who had first spoken up on the bus, sat in the front row. She had eagerly joined their initiative after Tanya reached out to her through social media. Ray, the bus driver, had also come, still in his uniform after finishing his shift. "I'm going to be honest with you all," Tanya continued, gaining confidence. "When Diane first suggested we work together, I was skeptical. Why should I help someone who had treated me that way? But then I realized something important: if we only talk to people who already agree with us, nothing ever changes." Diane stepped forward to join Tanya at the front of the room. "What happened on that bus was my mistake, my failing," she admitted openly. "But thanks to Tanya's willingness to give me a second chance, it's becoming an opportunity for all of us to grow." The workshop began with a simple exercise. Everyone was asked to pair up with someone they didn't know and share a time when they had felt like an outsider. The room filled with conversation as strangers opened up to one another, finding unexpected common ground in their experiences. "I never thought I'd be doing something like this," Diane confided to Tanya as they observed the pairs talking. "If you had told me a month ago that I'd be co-leading a community workshop with a teenager I met on a bus, I would have said you were crazy." Tanya laughed. "Life is full of surprises, I guess." As the evening progressed, the group moved into deeper discussions about unconscious bias and how small daily interactions could either build walls or bridges between people. There were uncomfortable moments and challenging conversations, but there was also laughter and genuine connection. By the end of the night, many participants were exchanging phone numbers and making plans to attend the next workshop. A local journalist who had covered the original bus incident wrote a follow-up piece about the Building Bridges initiative, bringing even more attention to their efforts. The story might have ended there, a feel-good tale of reconciliation that lasted for one news cycle before fading from public memory. But what happened next surprised everyone, especially Tanya. 2 months after the first workshop, Tanya was invited to speak at her school's assembly. Standing before her peers and teachers, she shared the story of the bus incident and how it had transformed from a moment of discrimination into a community movement. "Sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes," she told her fellow students. "But only if we're brave enough to stay engaged instead of walking away." The school principal was so impressed that she implemented a peer mediation program based on the Building Bridges model. Tanya was asked to help train student mediators, giving her a leadership role she had never imagined for herself. Diane, meanwhile, had been doing her own work. She joined a local racial justice organization and began facilitating difficult conversations in her workplace about creating more inclusive environments. The woman who had once blocked a black girl from sitting next to her was now advocating for diversity initiatives and examining her own privilege in ways that sometimes made her uncomfortable but always helped her grow. One evening, after a particularly successful workshop at the community center, Tanya received an unexpected email. It was from a producer at a national morning show who had seen the viral video and followed the subsequent developments. They wanted to interview Tanya and Diane about their journey from conflict to collaboration. "I don't know about this," Tanya told her mother, showing her the email. "It feels weird to get attention for something that started with such an ugly moment." Her mother considered this thoughtfully. Sometimes people need to see examples of healing and growth. There's so much negativity in the world, maybe your story could give people hope. After discussing it with Diane, Tanya agreed to the interview. They appeared on the morning show the following week, sitting side by side on a couch as they recounted their story to millions of viewers. "The easiest thing would have been to stay enemies," Diane explained to the host. "It's much harder to do the work of reconciliation and change." Tanya nodded in agreement. "We're not saying one conversation fixes everything. We still have different lives and different perspectives. But we're showing that it's possible to learn from each other if you're willing to listen." The interview went viral, even more widely than the original bus video. Requests began pouring in from schools, community organizations, and corporations, all wanting Tanya and Diane to share their story and workshop model. 6 months after their national television appearance, Tanya sat in her bedroom staring at a letter she could hardly believe was real. It was from Georgetown University, offering her early admission with a full scholarship. The admissions committee had specifically mentioned her community work and leadership in their decision. "Mom," she called out, her hands trembling. "You need to see this." Her mother rushed in, and tears filled her eyes as she read the letter. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered, pulling Tanya into a tight hug. Tanya couldn't help but reflect on the strange path that had led here. One horrible moment on a bus had somehow opened doors she never imagined possible. That same week, the Building Bridges program was being implemented in 12 different schools across the city. What had begun as a single workshop had grown into a curriculum that trained students and teachers to facilitate difficult conversations about race, privilege, and community. Diane had left her corporate job to work full-time with a nonprofit that specialized in diversity and inclusion training. She often told people that getting caught on camera during her worst moment had ultimately led to her finding her true purpose. "Sometimes life's most important lessons come wrapped in shame and regret," she would say during workshops. "What matters is what you do next." On a crisp autumn afternoon, Tanya and Diane met at the same coffee shop where they'd had their first real conversation. They had a ritual now of meeting monthly to check in on their program and their lives. "I got in," Tanya announced, sliding the acceptance letter across the table. Diane's face lit up. "Georgetown. Tanya, that's incredible. I keep thinking about how none of this would have happened if you hadn't moved your bag that day," Tanya said thoughtfully. "Or if you hadn't come back to apologize." Diane shook her head. "And I keep thinking about how none of it would have happened if you hadn't been willing to see me as more than just that terrible moment." A notification chimed on Tanya's phone. It was from Zoe, sharing news that their Building Bridges program had just received a major grant from a national foundation. The funding would allow them to expand to 50 more schools in the coming year. "We're really doing this," Tanya said, her voice filled with wonder. "Yes, we are," Diane agreed. "But we're just getting started." As they left the coffee shop, they passed the bus stop where their story had begun. The same route still ran through the neighborhood, carrying hundreds of strangers each day, people who might never speak to one another, or who might, in a single unexpected moment, change each other's lives forever. "You know what the most surprising part of all this is?" Tanya said as they paused at the crosswalk. "What's that?" Diane asked. That sometimes the people who seem furthest apart just need a bridge to find their way to each other. The light changed, and they crossed the street together, continuing a journey that had started with the worst in humanity but was now revealing some of the best. 1 year after the bus incident, Tanya stood at a podium in the city hall, addressing a room full of community leaders, educators, and students. At 17, she still felt nervous public speaking, but her passion for their cause always pushed her through the anxiety. "When we started building bridges, we had no idea it would grow like this," she said, gesturing to the large screen behind her that displayed statistics on the program's impact. "In just 1 year, over 5,000 students have participated in our workshops, and reported incidents of bullying and discrimination have decreased by 30% in participating schools." The audience applauded enthusiastically. Sitting in the front row, Diane beamed with pride. Beside her sat Ray, the bus driver who had stood up for Tanya that day. He had become one of their most dedicated volunteers, often sharing his experiences from 30 years of witnessing both conflict and kindness on his routes. After the presentation, a city council member approached Tanya with an unexpected proposition. "We'd like to make building bridges an official city-funded program," she explained. "With proper resources, we could implement it in every school and community center across the city." Tanya was speechless. This was bigger than anything she had imagined. That evening, she called Diane to share the news. "That's amazing, Tanya," Diane exclaimed. "But I have news too. I got a call from the governor's office today. They want us to present our program at the state education conference next month." Tanya sat on her bed, trying to process how far they had come. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if people hadn't recorded that day on the bus?" she asked quietly. "All the time," Diane admitted. "I might still be that angry, prejudiced woman, too afraid to face my own biases. And all these kids might never have had the chance to learn what we've been teaching them." The following weekend, they held a special workshop for the original passengers from the bus who had witnessed their confrontation. Many had stayed in touch and supported their initiative from the beginning. Zoe, now finished with nursing school, shared how the experience had made her a better advocate for her patients. The elderly gentleman who had offered Tanya his seat spoke about how the incident had reminded him of similar moments from the civil rights era he had lived through. "Sometimes history doesn't just repeat itself," he said wisely. "Sometimes it gives us a chance to write a different ending." After the workshop, Tanya and Diane walked through the park, discussing their plans for the statewide expansion of their program. "I'm thinking of deferring college for a year," Tanya confessed. "Georgetown is supportive of the idea. They said the work we're doing is too important to put on hold." Diane nodded thoughtfully. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you. But remember, your education matters too." As they reached a small pond, they paused to watch the sunset reflect on the water. A family walked by, parents with 2 young children who were laughing and chasing each other along the path. "That's why we do this," Tanya said softly. "So those kids grow up in a world a little better than the one we have now." Diane smiled. One bridge at a time. 2 years after the fateful bus ride, Tanya sat in a crowded auditorium at the National Youth Leadership Conference in Washington, D.C. She was now 18 and had just completed her first semester at Georgetown University after deferring for a year to develop Building Bridges. The conference moderator's voice echoed through the hall. "Our next speaker is someone whose story began with discrimination but transformed into one of the most successful youth-led community programs in the country. Please welcome Tanya Mitchell." As Tanya approached the podium, she scanned the audience of over 1,000 young leaders from across the nation. Her journey from that humiliating moment on the bus to this prestigious stage seemed almost unbelievable. "When I was 16, she began, a woman wouldn't let me sit next to her on a bus because of the color of my skin. Today, that same woman is one of my closest friends and allies." She paused as murmurs rippled through the crowd. "I'm not here to tell you that forgiveness is easy, or that reconciliation happens overnight. What I am here to tell you is that when we choose courage over comfort, when we lean into difficult conversations instead of avoiding them, transformation becomes possible, not just for individuals, but for entire communities. Tanya shared how Building Bridges had now expanded to over 100 schools across 3 states, with measurable improvements in school climate and reductions in disciplinary incidents. Our program works because it's not about pointing fingers or assigning blame, she explained. It's about creating spaces where people can be honest about their experiences, confront uncomfortable truths, and commit to doing better, together. After her speech, a young Asian American student approached her with tears in her eyes. "Your story gives me hope," she said. "There's so much division in my school, I didn't think things could change." That evening, Tanya video called Diane, who couldn't attend the conference due to a family emergency. "How did it go?" Diane asked eagerly. "Amazing," Tanya replied. "They want to feature Building Bridges in their National Resource Guide for schools." And guess who was in the audience? The Secretary of Education. Diane's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" "Very. He's invited us to join a task force on improving school climate and reducing bias incidents in education." Diane shook her head in amazement. "From a bus seat to the Department of Education. Unbelievable." "I kept thinking about something Ray said at our last workshop," Tanya shared. "About how the small moments define us more than the big ones. That day on the bus was just a few minutes of our lives, but look at everything that's grown from it." Later that night, as Tanya walked back to her dorm through the Georgetown campus, she received an unexpected text message. It was from the elderly gentleman who had offered her his seat on the bus 2 years ago. "Just saw you on the news from the conference. So proud of what you've accomplished. Remember, young people like you have always been the ones to push us forward. Keep going." Tanya smiled at her phone, tears welling in her eyes. The message reminded her that their work wasn't just about building bridges between different races or generations, it was about recognizing our shared humanity in a world determined to divide us. As she looked up at the night sky, Tanya felt both small and significant, one person who had turned pain into purpose, one story that had sparked countless others. 3 years after the bus incident, Tanya and Diane stood together at the entrance of a brand new community center. A large sign above the door read, "The Bridge, a center for dialogue and understanding." This was the physical manifestation of their work, a permanent space dedicated to the principles they had been teaching. "I can't believe we actually did it," Tanya whispered, now a confident 20-year-old sophomore at Georgetown, studying sociology with a focus on conflict resolution. Diane squeezed her hand. "You did it. This was your vision." The journey to this moment hadn't been smooth. After the initial excitement and support, they had faced backlash from those who thought their message of reconciliation was too simplistic, too forgiving. Others had tried to co-opt their story for political purposes that neither of them supported. There had been painful moments when Tanya questioned if she was doing enough, if their work was addressing the root causes of systemic racism. There were times when Diane faced criticism from people who believed she didn't deserve redemption. Their friendship had been tested, but it had endured. As the ribbon-cutting ceremony began, Tanya spotted familiar faces in the crowd. Zoe was there with her husband and new baby. Ray had retired from bus driving and now served as the center's transportation coordinator, ensuring everyone in the community had access to their programs. The elderly gentleman who had offered his seat that day, Mr. Wilson, as they now knew him, sat in the front row, using a cane but still insisting on attending every major event. The mayor handed Tanya the large ceremonial scissors. "Would you do the honors?" Before cutting the ribbon, Tanya addressed the gathered crowd. "This center exists because of a moment that could have gone very differently. It exists because people on a bus chose to speak up instead of looking away. It exists because someone who made a mistake chose accountability over defensiveness. And it exists because we all decided that talking to each other is better than talking about each other. As the ribbon fell, cheers erupted from the crowd. Journalists snapped photos of Tanya and Diane embracing in front of the building they had helped create. Inside, the center housed meeting spaces for community dialogues, classrooms for workshops, and offices for restorative justice practitioners. One wall displayed photos documenting their journey, including a still frame from the original viral video, alongside images of their first workshop, Tanya's college acceptance, and countless community events they had led. That evening, after the crowds had gone, Tanya and Diane walked through the quiet building. "Do you ever think about how differently things could have turned out?" Diane asked. "All the time," Tanya replied. "If you hadn't moved your bag, if no one had spoken up, if you hadn't come back to apologize, if I hadn't agreed to meet you." So many small choices, Diane mused. They paused at a large window overlooking the city. In the distance, they could see buses moving along their routes, carrying hundreds of strangers who might never speak to each other, or who might, in a single moment, change each other's lives forever. "That's why this place matters," Tanya said softly. "To remind people that those small choices can change everything." For years after the bus incident, Tanya sat in her dormitory room at Georgetown, staring at her laptop screen in disbelief. A documentary about the bridge and the movement it had inspired had just been nominated for a prestigious film award. The filmmaker had spent a year following Tanya, Diane, and the community they had built, capturing both their triumphs and struggles. Her phone buzzed with a message from Diane. "Have you seen the news? We're going to the award ceremony." Tanya smiled, still amazed by how their story continued to reach new audiences. But lately, she had been wrestling with a difficult decision. As graduation approached, she had received multiple job offers from nonprofit organizations and educational institutions across the country. Each opportunity would take her in a slightly different direction, and away from the community center she and Diane had built. Later that week, during her regular visit home, Tanya met Diane at their favorite coffee shop, the same one where they'd had their first real conversation years ago. "I need your advice," Tanya said after they'd settled with their drinks. "I've been offered a fellowship with the National Center for Community Dialogue. It would mean moving to Chicago for 2 years." Diane studied her face. "That's an incredible opportunity. But you're worried about leaving." Tanya nodded. "The bridge is still so new. There's so much more we need to do here." "The bridge was never meant to be about just you and me," Diane reminded her gently. "It was always about creating something bigger than ourselves, something that could continue even when we're not there." "But," Tanya began. "No buts," Diane interrupted with a smile. "When that woman, when I, wouldn't let you sit down on that bus, did you ever imagine you'd be worrying about leaving a community center you helped create to accept a national fellowship?" Tanya laughed. "Not exactly. Your journey doesn't end here," Diane continued. "In fact, maybe this is exactly what needs to happen next. You taking what we've learned to other communities, while others step up here." The following Sunday, they held a special community meeting at the bridge. More than 100 people gathered in the main hall, volunteers, program participants, and supporters who had been part of their journey. "I have an announcement to make," Tanya said, standing before them. "I've accepted a fellowship that will take me to Chicago for the next 2 years." Murmurs spread through the crowd. "But the bridge isn't going anywhere," she continued. "In fact, today we're launching a leadership council made up of community members who will guide this center into its next chapter." She introduced the 12 council members, a diverse group including high school students, retirees, and working professionals who had all been touched by the program in different ways. Among them was Mr. Wilson, the elderly gentleman from the bus, who had become one of their most dedicated volunteers despite his advancing age. "What began as a confrontation on a bus has become a movement," Tanya said, her voice strong with emotion. "And movements don't depend on 1 or 2 people, they thrive when everyone takes ownership. As the meeting concluded, people lined up to congratulate Tanya and share what the bridge had meant to them. A teenage boy handed her a hand-drawn card signed by all the youth program participants. "You showed us that one voice can make a difference," he said simply. Walking home that evening, Tanya felt a complex mix of emotions: pride in what they had built, excitement for her new adventure, and a bittersweet awareness that life's most meaningful chapters must eventually give way to new ones. 5 years after the bus incident, Tanya stood at the window of her Chicago apartment, watching the snow fall gently on the city streets below. At 21, she had completed her first year of the fellowship and had helped establish bridge programs in 4 Midwestern cities. Each one built on the model she and Diane had created but adapted to address the unique challenges of its own community. Her phone rang. It was Diane calling for their weekly check-in. "How did the Detroit launch go?" Diane asked after they'd exchanged greetings. "Better than expected," Tanya replied. "We had over 200 people at the first workshop. The local school superintendent wants to implement the curriculum district-wide." "That's fantastic," Diane said. "Things are going well here too. The council just secured a 3-year grant from the Community Foundation." There was a pause, and Tanya could sense Diane had something more to share. "What is it?" she prompted. "I got a call from the White House yesterday," Diane said, her voice betraying her excitement. "They're launching a national initiative on community reconciliation, and they want the bridge to be one of their model programs." Tanya nearly dropped her phone. "The White House? Are you serious?" "Very. They want both of us there for the announcement next month. Can you come back for it?" "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," Tanya laughed. A month later, they stood together in the East Room of the White House among leaders from various community organizations across the country. As the president spoke about the importance of grassroots efforts to bridge divides, Tanya couldn't help but marvel at the journey that had brought them here. "5 years ago, I was just a high school student trying to find a seat on a crowded bus," she whispered to Diane. "Now we're at the White House. It doesn't seem real." "It's real," Diane assured her. "But it's not about us being here. It's about what happens because we're here. How many more people will start their own bridges because of this visibility?" After the ceremony, a presidential advisor approached them. "The president would like to meet you both privately," she said, guiding them to a small adjoining room. The brief meeting was both humbling and affirming. The president shared how their story had resonated with him personally and asked thoughtful questions about their methodology. "What you've created is exactly what this country needs right now," he told them. "Not top-down solutions, but person-to-person connections that rebuild trust." That evening, as they walked along the National Mall, Tanya received a video call from Mr. Wilson and the Leadership Council back home, all eager to hear about their White House experience. "We're so proud of you both," Mr. Wilson said, his voice slightly weaker than when they'd first met, but his spirit as strong as ever. "But not surprised. I knew from that day on the bus that you two would do something special." After ending the call, Tanya and Diane sat on a bench facing the Lincoln Memorial, its marble columns glowing in the evening light. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't been so awful that day?" Diane asked quietly. Tanya considered this. "I think about it sometimes. But I've realized something important. What matters isn't the moment of conflict. What matters is what we choose to do with it." They sat in comfortable silence, watching tourists move up and down the steps of the memorial, strangers from all corners of the country and the world, each carrying their own stories, their own bridges yet to be built. 10 years after the bus incident, a large crowd gathered at City Park for a special anniversary celebration. "A decade of building bridges," read the banner stretched across the entrance. What had begun as a confrontation between strangers had blossomed into a nationwide movement with programs in over 50 cities. Tanya, now 26 and holding a master's degree in public policy, stood at the podium addressing the hundreds who had come to celebrate. Her confidence and poise had only grown with the years, but she still carried the same passionate belief in the power of difficult conversations to transform communities. 10 years ago, I was denied a seat on a bus, she began. Today, we have created thousands of seats at tables where people from all backgrounds come together to listen, learn, and grow. Diane stood nearby, now the executive director of the National Bridge Alliance that coordinated all the local programs. Her hair had a few strands of gray now, and the journey hadn't always been easy, but the transformation in her life had been just as profound as the movement she helped create. In the front row sat Ray, the bus driver whose intervention had been crucial that day. Beside him was Zoe, whose courage to speak up had inspired others. Her children now participated in youth bridge programs. And there was Mr. Wilson, now in a wheelchair but still present for every important milestone, his eyes bright with pride. After the speeches and presentations, Tanya and Diane found a quiet moment together away from the crowds. "Did you ever imagine this?" Tanya asked, gesturing toward the celebration. "Never," Diane admitted. "When I woke up that morning 10 years ago, I was just a bitter, angry woman with a lot of unexamined prejudice. I couldn't have dreamed that my worst moment would lead to my best purpose." They watched as children played on the grass nearby, kids from different backgrounds laughing together, untouched by the barriers that so often divide adults. "That's the real success," Tanya said softly. "Not the awards or the White House visits or even the programs. It's them, growing up in communities where difficult conversations happen, where bridges are built before walls." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the park, they walked back toward the celebration, back toward the community that had formed because two people had chosen connection over division, understanding over anger, and hope over hate. What had begun with a woman blocking a black girl from sitting had, improbably, opened the way for countless others to find their seats at the table.